performances that we know no one believes.
Hey guys, all right, here we go. Hey guys, how's everybody doing tonight? Is there, John, are you ready?
Yes.
Cool. Alyssa, are you ready?
Yep, go ahead.
Cool. So I wanted to welcome everybody to our program tonight. Tonight's talk will be by John Bryan, who has very graciously agreed to speak with us and present on Robert Mills and his research regarding him, and Benjamin Latrobe. So this is a program for the Carpenters Company, which you guys probably all know. I just wanted to say that we do all sorts of wonderful programming, both in person and online. In fact, in a couple of weeks, on April 26th, we will be having a fairly large award ceremony for the David McCullough Prize for Excellence in American Public History. That award will be going to Christy Coleman. That is an in-person event with a variety of different ticket options, and it will be held outside of Carpenters Hall and at the Museum of the American Revolution. You know, take a look at our website. We got lots of stuff going on all the time. I'll introduce John in a second, but I just wanted to also say throughout this presentation, if you guys could stay on mute, just for ease of hearing, so everybody can hear what's happening clearly. Just, you know, just for the sake of smoothness and for the quality of the recording. If you have a question, please drop it in the chat box, and my colleague Alyssa will get to it at the end of the program. Yeah, if you have any questions, please type them out, and we will be conscientiously monitoring the chat. So John, as you can see, has joined us tonight. John Bryan is an honorable member of the American Institute of Architects and is a noted architectural historian and professor emeritus of art history. He has taught at the University of South Carolina, and his publications have given national prominence to the architectural heritage of the South, notably through his award-winning G.W. Vanderbilt Biltmore Estate, The Campus Guide, Duke University, and Robert Mills, America's First Architect. Sorry, I should have broken that up better. So his award-winning G.W. Vanderbilt Biltmore Estate, The Campus Guide, Duke University, and Robert Mills, America's First Architect. Mr. Bryan spends his summers at his family home on Swans Island in Maine, where he writes, sails, paints, and builds wooden boats and barns. So John, take it away. And I just wanted to thank you again on behalf of the company for your research and for your work and for presenting to us tonight. Yeah, take it away.
Go ahead and begin, Elisa.
Yep, go ahead. It's all you.
Okay. Well, so tonight I'm going to talk about not superficial style, but about Mills' education with Benjamin Henry Latrobe and Thomas Jefferson and others, and the influence they had on his career, mainly with the construction techniques of laminated wooden domes, the Delorme system, and vaulted masonry, which are really the foundations of his career. But let me start, before we get into the slides, with 2 or 3 minutes of Mills' background. Mills was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1781. His father, by the way, was under house arrest at that point by the British. Mills grew up there. Before the Revolution, his father had been a successful tailor and had sent Robert's two older brothers to Edinburgh to be educated. After the Revolution, however, he didn't have the money. Robert didn't go abroad, apparently didn't go to college, but they had a neighbor, James Hoban, who in 1799 won the competition for the design of what we call the White House. It was then called, of course, the President's Palace. And Hoban went to Washington to do that. And shortly after that, Mills followed him there and worked for approximately 2 years as Hoban's apprentice and or assistant. One of Robert's older brothers, when he came back from Edinburgh, had brought an architectural book and a drafting book and opened lessons in the evening for young men. Robert probably did that, although we can't document that. There were other carpenter builders who were doing the same thing in Charleston, and some of them advertised when Robert was 14 that they had a model by a young man of a complete house and so on and so forth. So Robert was probably educated in Charleston a bit before he went to work with Hoban. Hoban finishes the work on the President's Palace and is working at the Capitol. And when Jefferson comes to Washington, and that's where Mills' graduate school, if you will, really begins. Alicia, can we have the first slide? So this drawing of Monticello was drawn for, it's signed, was drawn for Jefferson by Mills. Mills had nothing to do, of course, with the design. But this drawing, like the first few things I'm going to show, makes the point that Mills early in his career had access or contact with Jefferson, and through Jefferson, and with Jefferson's library, and with Jefferson's fascination with European ideas. One of the architectural ideas, one of the things that comes through very early in Mills' work is he was interested in going beyond the American vernacular. And tonight I'm going to focus on two ways in which he throughout his career does that. He's not interested in, whenever the budget will allow, he's not interested in stick-built Georgian or federal architecture. He wants to do something quite different. The dome in that slide is very interesting. Alexa, we've lost our slide and we've got Ann Lindsay on my screen now.
Yep, sorry, that was I tried to plug a power source into my computer and it messed everything up. So let me bring it back up.
Okay. And when you're successful, which I'm sure you will be, let's go to the next slide.
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. This has never happened before.
That's all right. I'm old and have been doing this long enough that everything that can go wrong has gone wrong. I'm not going to be flustered.
Okay, here we go.
Now we want to go to the next slide, please. So Mills meets Jefferson apparently in 1801, 1802, and Jefferson recognizes that Mills is an accomplished young draftsman and has Mills do a series of drawings for him. And Mills is going to very carefully nurture that relationship until 1826. Jefferson kept Mills' drawings, and there are 2 or 3 of them, I think, on exhibit today at Monticello. This is one of a Villa Rotunda that Mills did, probably using Jefferson's, being directed by Jefferson, and using a probably drawn from Jefferson's Leone copy of Palladio, But the important thing I want to show about this building, this drawing, is look at the interior of the dome and the rafters that support the dome, and you see a series of dots. And that series of dots is a nailing schedule, because these curved rafters are composed of laminated or doubled and trebled short curved pieces of wood to create the necessary ribs to support that dome. Next slide, please. And that technique was popularized, if not invented, by a French architect, 16th century architect, Philibert Delorme. And here we see the way the ribs are put together. Of course, the curvilinear roof or a dome was not part of the American building tradition. And we're going to see that Mills is going to use it and make himself exceptional very early in his career. It's an obviously very interesting technique, and I won't go into it more than to say it was not traditional here. Next, please. In 1802, work on the President's house was coming to close. Mills turned to Jefferson and asked, "Mr. President, what should I do now to further my reputation?" And it's important to remember that Mills always claimed that he was the first native-born American to train specifically for a career in architecture. Those before him, like Bulfinch, were gentlemen amateurs, or like his older brother, Thomas, were people trying to better themselves through offering lessons and that sort of thing. Jefferson gave Mills a letter of introduction to Charles Bulfinch and directed Mills to take a tour of the Eastern Seaboard. And I imagine, I've not seen an earlier example, but I imagine that Mills' tour in 1802 was the first specifically architectural tour in the United States. And as he went north, he of course stopped in Philadelphia and did a very careful drawing of Latrobe's, the facade of Latrobe's Bank of Pennsylvania, 1797. So it was new then, and it was, well, Talbot Hamlin says it was the first fully Greek Revival building in the United States. Looking at it, looking at the drawing, and knowing, of course, that it's basically pen and ink and wash, hard medium to control, it's easy to understand why Jefferson was attracted to Mills as a draftsman. This is one of two drawings that Mills gave to Jefferson from the tour. The other one, I don't have an image of, but was McBean's church in New York. So Mills goes north. We know that he visited Bulfinch, and we know that he went across the Charles River and visited Jebediah Morse, who was then developing a reputation as an American geographer. And in Boston, while visiting Bulfinch, I think Mills was very much influenced by Bulfinch's work for the city of Boston, and today we might call it urban redevelopment. He comes back, Mills comes back to Washington and again contacts Jefferson and says, "Now, Mr. President, what should I do now?" And Jefferson gives him a letter of introduction to Benjamin Henry Latrobe. Next slide, please. At the time, Latrobe was working on an abortive attempt to develop the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. And the Latrobe papers have a number of manuscripts about this. Latrobe said they surveyed 30 different routes, got involved in land speculation and one thing and another. Latrobe finally started determined a route, got it approved, and began a series of feeder canals to bring water. Of course, in the end, the project failed. But the sum of it, Mills went into Latrobe's office, and he was going to be there essentially from late 1802 or 3 to 1808. This is what they were working on. This is a little feeder canal. Alicia? And I have other voices on my screen, but I'm just going to be rude and talk over them.
It's okay. I've been muting people, so I got them. Sorry about that, John.
That's all right. That's all right. This is the only remnant, as far as I know, of that feeder canal that Thomas Vickers and Weston were working on for Latrobe when Mills entered the office. This is in Elton, Maryland, on a hillside up in the shrubs. It was a research adventure in 1981, I think. But this is the first example I know of Mills' direct contact with a vaulted masonry structure. And its survival, even in this primitive state, suggests why it may have appealed to Mills. Mills from Jefferson, Mills gets a commitment to building permanently. Of course, Jefferson very famously remarked that Americans every 25 years tear down a quarter of what they've built, and Mills is going to become noted for using vaulted masonry as literally and figuratively the foundation of most of his construction and career. Next slide, please. And the way vaulted masonry, of course, is done is you build wooden centering or a wooden support, and then lay the stone or brick masonry over it. And when the cement hardens, next slide, please. When the cement hardens, you take the centering away, and the masonry then stands strong. Mills is going to base most of his public buildings, when the budget allows, on this vaulted masonry technique. Where either end of the masonry arch is footed on columns that take the load to the ground. We'll see more of this coming up. This too, like the Delorme domes technique, was not part of the American vernacular, but it's going to be absolutely central to Mills' career. Next slide, please. And if you take that centering and you turn it perpendicular, you create a groin vault, and you span, in this case, a square cubic space with no interior support, and all the load is carried down the piers on the four corners. And this is going to be the basic of Mills' plans for public spaces. We're going to see a number of buildings like this. In addition to being permanent, vaulted masonry is fireproof, because once you've removed the centering, the wooden centering, there's nothing flammable left. And of course, fire was a tremendous hazard in wooden construction, particularly in urban settings. And from Mills' point of view, particularly in public buildings where you had congregations of people, often people who were, in a sense, incarcerated or enclosed as in insane asylums and hospitals and prisons. And Mills would really make fireproof construction kind of the gold coin of the realm in public construction. In preparing this talk, I thought about how many groin vaulted interior spaces did Mills create? And I gave up counting. I don't have a complete set of Mills papers here in Maine, but it's between 1,000 and 1,500 offices and cells and hospital rooms. Mills between 1802 and 1851 is going to build over 200 buildings, be responsible for designing and building over 200 buildings from Newburyport, Massachusetts to New Orleans. A very, very productive career. Next. That's self-explanatory and would be typical of most of Mills' public buildings. Next. So 1802, Mills begins to work in Latrobe's office as a draftsman and assistant, and gradually work his way up until by 1806, he's clerk of the works. That is sent by Latrobe, who's busy down in Washington and working on the canal, and Mills is sent as really the supervisor on site, eyes and ears for some of Latrobe's projects in Philadelphia. But in 1804, Mills' father dies in Charleston, and Mills goes home briefly to help settle the estate. And while he's there, the opportunity for several projects come up. One is St. Michael's Church, which had been built on its Anglican church, had been built in the 1760s. The congregation had grown and they wanted to expand the church. And Mills very quickly in 1804 prepared a plan for the vestry. And he was going to add several bays to the east end of the church and create an apse, which we see here in the center with the raised pulpit. And then, and this was the radical thing, the un-American thing, if you will, he was going to cut into the ties and the rafters and create a curved roof. The church was rectangular and you couldn't create a Delorme type dome, but Mills wanted to do this because in 1797, Latrobe had written an essay on acoustics, and Mills clearly had, it had not been published. It would be published in Edinburgh in 1818, but Mills had access to Latrobe's papers, and he paraphrases or plagiarizes from Latrobe's essay in his letters, in Mills' letters to the vestry of St. Michael's about acoustics. And Latrobe's theory was basically that sound travels smoothly along curved surfaces, but sound waves break up when they hit flat surfaces. And so the ideal acoustic room would be the interior of a sphere, but you can't, that's not a very useful space. So you create these curves to make the sound flow along the interior surface of the building, like water in a river, without rocks, so to speak. Well, the vestry of St. Michael's thanked Mills, paid him a little bit, but of course they thought they can't risk the roof of St. Michael's Church. And so they didn't do it. They didn't cut the roof and create the interior acoustics surfaces that Mills wanted. Next. But Mills would very quickly go on to build several other circular churches capped by DeLorme domes. Only 2 of Mills' working drawings survive. This one for the Sansom Street Church in Philadelphia. And let's take a moment and look at the drawing. I want to say the strategy of the drawing. The reason the drawings don't survive, of course, is they were used on site and tattered and torn in the usage. But we can see in the upper left-hand quadrant the DeLorme system of laminated ribs. The upper right-hand quadrant is a view of the exterior, the sheathing. In the lower left hand, we're looking down on the ribs, and in the lower right hand, we're looking down on the finished roof. Next. Right down the street from St. Michael's, in 1804, there was a Congregational church, and they hired Mills and built a circular church. Here we don't have a photograph of it. This is the only one I had. This is 1861. It's been burned in the war. This too had a DeLorme dome on the top. Mills, when he's totting up his career, doesn't include this among his buildings because the congregation had put a quite massive spire on the facade of the church, which Mills was very disappointed by. Unlike Latrobe, Mills was very pliant and accommodating with his patrons, and never walked away, resigned from a job because of alterations. But he felt this church didn't reflect what he wanted, but it did reflect the use of the circular plan and the DeLorme dome to create an acoustically better space. And Mills felt this was very important in a room designed for public speaking. Next, please. The only one of these churches to survive is the Monumental Church in Richmond, Virginia. This is a Mills project, 1811. And in this project, it was a competition, and Mills beat Latrobe in the competition. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And Mills was never again to work with Latrobe. This church is still there, and I think it's now used by the medical school at the University of Virginia. Next. It too has a DeLorme dome. But in 1808, Mills was, he was in love. He wanted to get married. He'd gotten a little bit of money from his father's estate. And while he was in Charleston in 1804, the state of South Carolina advertised, and they were talking in the legislature about building a penitentiary. Mills very quickly put together a proposal for South Carolina and submitted it. He contacted both Jefferson and Latrobe for ideas about prisons. The state of South Carolina decided not to build a penitentiary in 1804. Instead, they increased the list of capital crimes. I must say, and this would be an editorial box, things in South Carolina have not changed very much. But in 1808, the Burlington County, New Jersey, decided to build a prison in Mount Holly, New Jersey, and Mills got that job, and that was the job that allowed him to leave Latrobe and set himself up independently, and by the way, to marry. And another editorial box would be that Mills wanted to marry Eliza Barnwell Smith, whose father in Withville, Virginia, was quite prominent. He was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and he did not encourage his daughter to marry Mills, apparently, because Mills, until he got this commission, didn't look like a very good prospect to support his daughter. But this building is remembered not because of its, I suppose, figuring in Mills' domestic situation, but because it's Mills' first fully fireproof building. Next slide, please. The whole plan is based on the use of these masonry arches, and the corridors are all barrel vaulted, and the cells flank the corridors on either side, and all the weight is carried to the ground in the piers that support the arches. The only structural wood is in the roof system. The Mount Holly jail is still there, vindicating Mills' system, I suppose, and it's open to the public. It's a small museum. Next slide, please. And here you see the long barrel vaulted corridors and the cells on either side. Next slide, please. Mills and Eliza moved to Baltimore, where, of course, Mills is going to work for several years, and he's going to design and develop the Baltimore Washington Monument, first major monument to George Washington. But in 1819, there was a banking collapse, and work in Baltimore came to a halt. But just at that point, the state of South Carolina in 1819 passed what they call the Public Improvements Act to build a series of buildings and canals to encourage development in the upstate, so that each county was to get a courthouse and a jail, in some cases bridges and canals, and there were to be other public buildings, and the one we see here is the South Carolina Asylum, an insane asylum in the state capital, Columbia, South Carolina. This building, Mills was hired by the state and put in charge of all the architectural aspects of the Public Improvements Act. The asylum was to be completely fireproof. It was based on Quaker English and Quaker literature coming out of England on the treatment of the insane. It's an interesting project in the architectural relationship to the treatment of insanity, in a sense, just like Mills integrates Latrobe's acoustic theory into an architectural form, which was not a traditional American form. Under the portico that we see here, next slide, please. We've got a publicly available example of Mills' use of the groined vaulted masonry spaces. Very clean and spare, with no exterior ornament of any kind. For the asylum, the appropriation was $30,000, but by the time, using the groined vaulted masonry, by the time Mills reached the cornice or the roof line of the asylum, they had spent just over $90,000. And so in 1823, Mills was fired by the state. I think another reason he was fired is Mills was a very prolific writer. He had written a pamphlet that the state of South Carolina should basically free the slaves and that's a long story, but that didn't set well with South Carolina. When he was fired by the state in 1823, he focused on writing and other really engineering projects. Mills would publish over 2,000 pages in the course of his career. One of the first projects he undertook, writing projects, was the Atlas of South Carolina, which was the first systematic mapping of any state. And this takes us back to his contact with Jebediah Morse on that architectural tour. Then he published an 800-page book, The Statistics of South Carolina, which is a verbal description of the contents of the Atlas. And he goes on and on. He proposes a rotary piston engine, an elevated monorail from Washington to New Orleans. Just very interesting all over the map. But he found that he working on a building by building basis. Next slide, please. Today, the people in the state of South Carolina think of him as kind of their historic architect. They think of it that the decade of the 1820s was a happy, successful period in Mills' life. And if you visit Charleston, South Carolina, you see the fireproof building. This is the fireproof building in Charleston, which was built as the county records office. And again, it is fireproof. And in this case, not only the use of the groin vaulted masonry, but even the window, the buttons in the windows are all iron. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful building, and it's now been converted. It was the home of the South Carolina Historical Society for really the better part of a century, I think. It's now being created into an event space. But this, like the portico of the asylum in Columbia, this is publicly accessible. It's a wonderful example of Mills' insistence on permanent fireproof construction based on vaulted masonry. Next, please. So finding it impossible to make a living working on a building by building basis and finding that his writing was not remunerative, Mills went to Washington. He was fortunate in that Andrew Jackson, who had been born in South Carolina, had just become president. And Jackson and the rest of the country, I suppose, too, was fortunate in that as Jackson became president, that international trade was being reactivated in the post-Napoleonic period, and there was a stream of transatlantic traffic that was bringing money into the eastern seaboard, and at the same time, the federal government was beginning to sell the Louisiana Purchase land to the west. So Jackson, for the first time, was able to settle the national debt, and the federal government was flush. And Mills very quickly began to receive public commissions, which were going to be the staple of his practice from 1830 until 1851. Today, we think of Mills' contribution to Washington as the monumental buildings on and visible from the mall. But really, his first project in Washington was the acoustic upfitting of the House of Representatives with screens and walls and things like that to try to, although he couldn't create curved surfaces, to try to make less echo in the sound. And then in the House of Representatives, then he built a series of custom houses. And here, now that he's working with a federal budget, he was able to build fully fireproof, vaulted masonry, custom houses in Newburyport, Massachusetts, New London, Connecticut, and New Bedford. He built a series, and those all reflect, of course, the transatlantic trade. He also built a series of marine hospitals for seamen who were sick away from home. And then in 1836, next please, he's going to be appointed architect to the federal government by Jackson. And he's also in that year going to win the competition for the Washington National Monument in Washington, D.C. But one of the little buildings, smaller buildings that we find in his diary in 1836 is this building. And I'm going to end with this building in a few minutes, but I want to point it out now and come back to it because it kind of sums some of the things I've been mentioning up. This was a library for the South Carolina College in Columbia, now the University of South Carolina. Today, this is the Caroliniana Library. It's an archival library for materials related to the history of the state. And looking at this drawing, we can see that it's got a dome. It's elevated, the drawing is elevated on an 18-foot high basement. And that dark mass under the portico, the drawing on the right-hand page, is a carriageway that would lead into the campus. We can see that the ground plan of that carriageway shows up right below the elevation. The reading room, which we see on the left-hand page, 56 feet in diameter, capped by the dome. The rooms on either side have the X, which is in the indication of the groin vault. Mills and other, there's 6 pairs of diary pages, and this is the only one I'm showing. But the diary, the notes on the diary note that Mills' estimate for the building, not fireproof, was $34,000. Fireproof was $64,000, but the appropriation was $10,000. So you can see that he had something of a dilemma. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But meanwhile, while he's negotiating this with the trustees of the University of South Carolina, he's very busy in Washington with the buildings that we all remember. Next. The Treasury was perhaps the biggest and certainly most prominent of these. It's all groin vaulted masonry interior. Its interior is much like the offices are much like a honeycomb, all the same, all the same dimensions of the offices, very, if you will, democratic. But the public spaces in the building next, yes. And the hallway, of course, groin vaulted. You can see that in the ceiling. And you can, the thing that's to me so impressive here is this flying staircase, slabs of stone, cantilevered out, mortised into the wall and cantilevered out. Again, avoiding all structural wood on the interior. By now, and now we're into the late 1830s and early 1840s, a younger generation of architects was beginning to compete with Mills and was criticizing his system, which I've already noted was typically more expensive than traditional wooden supported interior spaces. There was a congressional hearing about the Treasury building, the hearing prompted by some of his competitors, Ithieltown and others. And R.W. Thompson of Indiana defended Mills, saying that Mills has designed and constructed more public buildings than any man in America. He is the first native-born American who has studied and pursued the science of architecture as a profession. The arches in the Treasury building have not sprung or become dislodged even to the width of a single hair. Mill's system worked, and it was more economical than his competitor's public building. And R.W. Thompson goes on to say, in comparing Mill's public work to the work of others, he says, Latrobe's work on the Capitol cost $45 per square foot. The New York Custom House by Ithieltown cost $94 per square foot. Girard College by Thomas Eustick Walter cost $118 per square foot. The Treasury building by Mills cost $16 per square foot. His patent office cost $19 per square foot. And his general post office, which was the first marble-clad building in DC, cost $24 per square foot. Mills maintained that he had worked out a system of the groin vaults that did two things. By making the spaces the same, he was able to reuse the centering. He must have had a way of bolting or clamping the wooden centering together, setting up the vault, letting the masonry harden, and then moving and reusing the centering. The second thing was that because the thrust, the weight of the superstructure was carried by the piers, or in this case, the columns to the foundation, he was able to use thinner walls on the exterior and interior of the building, use less brick and less labor in order to keep the costs down. Next slide, please. We've noted that Mills had been appointed architect of the federal government in 1836. He had a number of schemes or plans for the enlargement of the US Capitol. And one of the early historians of the Capitol, Glenn Brown, says that from 1836 to 1851, Robert Mills was in charge of all the work at the Capitol. That included Bulfinch's Library of Congress, which Mills both repaired and renovated and in minor ways remodeled. Next slide, please. This is A.J. Davis's drawing of Bulfinch's Library of Congress in the US Capitol. And this is going to bring me back to the Caroliniana Library, because when the Board of Trustees decided they only had knew they only had $10,000, they decided they would do away with the Delorme Dome. They would do away with the 18-foot raised basement with a carriageway underneath and the fireproof vaulted offices on either side. Next. And they dropped the building to the ground, so to speak, so that it looks, one critic said, squat. And that's true. Remember, it was to be raised 18 feet. When Mills had to do this, lost the dome, he could no longer have the circular reading room. And so the contract for this building in 6 or 7 different places says it's to be like the Library of Congress. And Mills apparently sent measured drawings, which have been lost, 2 drawings signed by Mills for the building. Original proposal for the building do exist. And we know, therefore, that Mills was in contact with the Board of Trustees. And he is the only person who was in a position, next slide, please, to send them a measured drawing. And this is the reading room of the Caroliniana, which is within 3 inches of matching the Bullfinch Library of Congress, which has since burned. The contract for this building specifies in a number of places that the plaster work, for example, around the oculi, same lighting system that the Library of Congress had, is to match that of the Library of Congress. This building has just been restored. And if you're in Charleston and see the fireproof building, Columbia, and see the asylum, you should also go to the University of South Carolina and see Mills' reproduction of Bullfinch's Library of Congress. Thank you very much. And
Oh, thank you, John. Let me take my screen down. Here we go. All right, John, that was fantastic. Thank you. And as someone who spent many hours researching and studying in the Caroliniana and then moved to DC and then to Philadelphia, it was a good tour and a connector. So I thank you. So just a reminder, if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask John, you could drop them in the chat box. But I will start us off. John, do you think you could talk a little bit, and you touched on this a little bit in your presentation with the new generation of architects that kind of butted up against Mills, but taking a longer view, if you could talk about the lasting effect that you think that Mills had on the architectural profession?
The short answer is yes. Mills and Latrobe both noted that most of the professional problems they had were the problems of the pioneers, that the profession had not yet formed a fee structure. Mills was incredibly mobile. It seems to me that he traveled at least 2 weeks out of any given month. We've got several hundred letters from his wife, plaintive letters about his inability to make a living through architecture. It was hard, and his designs were often modified. I would even say almost typically modified by his clients. That was a problem. But as to his legacy, he always held firm to his belief that if you were spending public money, you should try to make it permanent. And the fact that so many of his buildings survive, and in many cases are still used by the same institutions for the same purposes, I think speaks volumes about the value of far-sighted permanent construction. For example, in Washington, the Treasury building is still used by the Treasury Department. The Patent Office building is still used for display, although now that display is the Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian. And the General Post Office is still used, but has been converted into a hotel. And the permanence of these structures all are based on his insistence on the use of this fireproof vaulted masonry, which was not an American tradition before Mills. And in many ways, I think our building codes, we might say, have Mills as the cornerstone, the public safety. He was particularly adamant about this for things like the asylum and prisons. And so, and then of course, in this talk, we didn't even mention the monuments, really, the major monuments. Mills believed, and he proposed many monuments that were never built, Mills believed that architecture, in a sense, in its monumental sense, was a teaching tool. And of course, we live in a time when monuments have become controversial, and some monuments, and some people want to basically change history. But Mills left us some of our greatest monuments, I think, no question about it. But I think the idea of permanence and fireproof construction, and Mills apparently was very, what should we say, diplomatic or effective in dealing with the people who were creating his buildings, the labor force. He never had significant troubles, was never bankrupt several times, but was never sued, as far as I know, about a construction project of any kind. So he was an admirable person. The other thing that really has always struck me about Mills is through his writing, we see that he was very, very farsighted. He proposed a transcontinental railroad, several routes, tried to get involved in the railroad business, which he saw as a, I want to say, a source of income for himself in the 1820s and 30s. It never panned out for him, but he was very, very farsighted. And a number of his obituaries almost speak of him as an American Leonardo, you know, that he had ideas that touched many, many facets of life. His idea, I just mentioned the rotary piston engine, that's a 32-page pamphlet that he never managed to get published. But the pistons, instead of going up and down, were supposed to go around and around. But at that time, we didn't have lubricants that would stand that kind of continual motion. And he was one of many people trying to develop and patent that. Didn't happen. So he was very bold and imaginative, and in that way inspiring. That would be one of his legacies for me. And willing to look elsewhere. And of course, that was the influence, I think, of Jefferson and Latrobe. Willing to look beyond the local practice. And so, you know, I still find him interesting. 30 years and I still find him interesting. Yeah.
Fascinating. John, I have a question from Jim Garrison. He says, any thoughts on why Latrobe, Mills, and their peers didn't revive the Roman use of concrete?
Didn't revive the Roman use of concrete? No, I'm not sure of the distinction he's making. Mills and Latrobe and Western.
I'm sorry, John. He says concrete vaulting.
No, I'm not sure. I'm really not. So there's your answer. That's like John Tower of Texas saying no, and then charge you $10,000. Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask John? Sorry, I'm scrolling through the chat. So you did touch on this a little bit, but one of our members had a question about the title of first American architect.
That's a fair question.
Yeah, so if you could expand on that a little bit, I know he would be grateful.
Certainly. Well, some people would say it was Bulfinch, but of course, Bulfinch was a wealthy Bostonian, took the European tour, asked Thomas Jefferson, who was in Paris at the time, what he should see to further his architectural education, came back to Boston and got involved in a series of disastrous real estate speculations and had to turn to architecture for money. Mills, on the other hand, as a young man, decided he was going to be an architect. And I personally think it was because Mills' family didn't have the money to set him up as a planter. He didn't have the money to go abroad in the beginning, never went abroad and was very proud of it, to train for law or medicine. But he sought a series of situations, first with Hoban and then Jefferson and then Latrobe, just set out systematically to become a designer and builder of buildings. And I'm not aware that anyone else had done that. And so in a sense, I agree with Mills. And Mills claimed several times that he was the first that had systematically done this.
So I don't know if you would have any thoughts on this, but Neil, our member who's in the audience, is pushing for Robert Smith as the first American architect. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Smith, but he, in fact, built Carpenters Hall.
I'm not familiar with Smith, so I can't comment, and I'm too old to try.
Understood. So we have another question from Paul Smith, and he wants to know if Mills influenced Richardson or Sullivan. Do you have first names, Paul? He said Richardson or Sullivan. We'll see if he can clarify. He says they were best known in Chicago.
The short answer there would probably be no.
Courtney Clark, who I believe is one of your former students at USC, says any feelings or knowledge about Mills's wife, or I'm sorry, about how Mills's wife felt about his profession and works, any chance that she had any influence on his works or projects?
I know that she, well, first of all, some years ago, the Smithsonian sponsored the collection of the papers of Robert Mills, and we found over 3,000 letters and contracts, manuscripts that had not been published, and over 200 drawings. And I think about 300, maybe 320 of those manuscripts were Eliza Barnwell Smith's letters to Robert, usually when he's away, complaining about his irregular employment and the difficulty of maintaining a household and dealing with vendors for firewood and food. But she said, bear and forbear, give and forgive. And she was very stoic, and they had seemed to have had an enduring relationship. I don't think she had any influence whatsoever on his architectural practice because he was away so much of the time. And that's another thing I neglected to mention was Mills' work was far-flung. I said Newburyport, Massachusetts to New Orleans, over 200 buildings. Early on, he developed a system of basically stapling together his drawings with directions for the builders, little building pamphlets, if you will, how to do it pamphlets. And this seems to have been something that he did Whether it's absolutely original with him or not, I'm not sure, but it was part of his management technique and part of the reason I think he was so productive.
So Paul Smith clarified, I'm not sure if this would change your answer, but he said he was referring to Louis Sullivan and Henry Hobson Richardson, who were the designers of some of the first tall office buildings in Chicago in the 1880s.
Yes, I'm familiar with them, and it's a wonderful question, and thank you very much for it, because one of the reasons Mills fell out of favor is, of course, he was working bringing to America an ancient, and to go back, a Roman system of the use of masonry. But by the 1840s, people were beginning to use steel and iron in various ways, both to carry loads and in tension. And when I read the congressional, Mr. Thompson's testimony on Mills' behalf, it was because Ithieltown and others had proposed using iron, and Mills was against using iron. And of course, Sullivan represents the introduction of the internal steel frame in lieu of the masonry system that Mills had used. I would argue, well, it remains to be seen, doesn't it? You may live long enough to see whether the steel is as permanent as Mills masonry. But the fact that Mills masonry has not moved so much as the width of a single hair, I think speaks volume. I don't know many modern buildings that will do much more than last the length of their mortgage.
And Jim Garrison very astutely pointed out that iron is not fireproof.
Right. Well, yes, the cast iron that was used was outlawed on facades because it melts, it collapses without warning. Yes.
Okay, last call for any questions for John.
Well, I would just like to take this moment of silence to thank everybody who participated and to congratulate Carpenters Hall. From my point of view, it's been a very slick production, and Alicia, I appreciate your walking me through everything you've done.
Oh, of course, this was an honor. Oh, I'm sorry, we do have one more question before we go, John. So Jim wants to know if the Mills building survived the earthquake in Charleston in 1883.
Jim, the short answer is it's there now, and you can go see it. And I suggest that you go see it before it's submerged, because yes, Charleston now floods at least 50 days a year.
That's a topic for another Zoom talk.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was fabulous. And I know everyone here enjoyed it. It was a true honor for me. So thank you everyone who attended, and I will be sending out a recording in about a week or so. And I hope everyone has a fabulous night. Thank you, John.
Thank you.